A hunter ventured into the frozen woods and came upon a horse surrounded by a pack of wolves. Instinctively, he raised his rifle, ready to intervene, but what happened next left him so shocked that the weapon slipped from his trembling hands. What he witnessed defied all logic and left him questioning if his eyes were playing tricks on him. The crack of a branch pierced the stillness, sharp and startling. Silas froze, his breath coming out in shallow puffs that vanished into the biting air. The winter of Blackwood this year wasn't just cold, it was vicious. A predator, the kind of cold that clawed its way under layers, gnawed at the bones, and made even the wolves retreat deeper into the forest. Trees stood draped in suffocating frost, their branches snapping under the weight of relentless ice. Silas had never seen the forest so lifeless. Even the faint scurries of squirrels or the distant hoots of owls had disappeared weeks ago. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting. He adjusted his woolen hat and kept moving, one deliberate step at a time, his boots crunching on the thick snow. His rifle hung across his back, not for hunting but for defense. Silas was no stranger to the forest's secrets, but today the air felt wrong, tense, as if something unseen was watching. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape against the blinding white of the clearing. A horse, lying crumpled on the ground, its brown coat stark against the snow's purity. Silas's heart jolted. The animal's legs twitched feebly, as though the will to stand had drained from its body. Around it, 4 wolves circled in near-silent unison, their sleek grey forms moving like shadows. Silas's instincts kicked in. He crouched low behind a cluster of snow-dusted shrubs, gripping his rifle with trembling fingers. His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched the wolves, their eyes gleaming with predatory focus. They were close now, each one drawing nearer to the horse's exposed flank. The largest wolf bared its teeth, a low growl rumbling from its chest. Silas swallowed hard. He'd seen wolves hunt before, but this was different. The horse wasn't fighting back. It didn't even try to stand. It lay there, its breaths shallow, its sides heaving against the icy ground. For a moment, Silas wondered if the cold had claimed it before the wolves could. Poor creature, he muttered under his breath, gripping the rifle tighter. He hated the thought of shooting, but if it meant ending the horse's suffering quickly, then something stopped him. Silas squinted, his breath hitching as he focused on their movements. They weren't lunging or snapping at the horse. Instead, they paced slowly around it, their eyes darting to the edges of the clearing, ears swiveling as if listening for something unseen. The largest wolf paused, sniffing the air, its gaze cutting toward Silas's hiding spot. Silas's fingers tightened on the rifle stock. He held his breath, praying the wind didn't betray his scent. The wolf lingered, its eyes narrowing, but then it turned back toward the horse. Suddenly, the wolves sprang into action. Silas's heart stopped as all 4 lunged toward the horse in unison, their teeth bared and claws tearing through the snow. His grip on the rifle tightened, ready to intervene, even though his trembling hands told him he might be too late. But they didn't attack. Instead, the wolves pressed against the horse's sides, nudging it with their muzzles and shoulders. Silas's mouth fell open as the horse, weak and trembling, struggled to its feet. Its legs wobbled like twigs about to snap, but the wolves didn't relent. They pushed and prodded until the animal finally stood, though unsteady. Silas rubbed his eyes, certain the cold was playing tricks on him. No way I didn't see that. No way. The horse swayed on its legs, its breath visible in shallow, white puffs. And then the wolves moved again. They backed away, forming a loose circle around the horse, their movements almost reverent. Not a sound escaped them as they resumed pacing, not as predators, but as protectors. Silas felt his knees weaken. What in God's name was he watching? He crouched lower, afraid to make a noise as the group began moving. Slowly, deliberately, the wolves flanked the horse as it took trembling steps deeper into the forest. It was no longer prey. It was the center of something much larger, something Silas couldn't begin to explain. Silas made it back to his cabin just as darkness swallowed the forest. His legs felt like lead, and his mind wouldn't stop racing. Had he really seen what he thought he saw? A horse with wolves as its escort? He poured himself a drink, trying to shake the unease that clung to him like frostbite. But no matter how hard he tried, the image wouldn't leave his mind. By the time he reached Mike's tavern that night, Silas's head was swimming with questions. The place was alive with chatter, the warmth from the hearth chasing away the bitter cold outside. Silas nursed a whiskey in the corner before finally blurting out the story. "I saw a horse out there," he started, his voice low but firm, "surrounded by wolves." His words drew a few curious glances, but it was the smirk on Tom Lance's face that made Silas's stomach turn. "And let me guess, they shared tea and biscuits after, huh?" Tom laughed, slapping his knee. "I'm serious," Silas said, his voice rising. "They didn't attack it. They helped it." The room erupted in laughter. Someone called out, "Silas, either the cold's gotten to you, or that whiskey's gone straight to your head." But not everyone laughed. Emery Vaughan, a quiet farmer who often kept to herself, leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Where did you see it?" she asked. Silas blinked, surprised by her tone. "Near the edge of the forest, by the sunken glade." "I've seen tracks," Emery said softly. "Near my farm, big ones. Wolves, maybe, but they didn't come near my chickens, like they were looking for something else." The laughter quieted as her words hung in the air. Everything started that morning. Emery tightened her coat against the biting cold as she stepped out onto the snow-covered porch. The sun was weak, barely piercing through the dense grey clouds that hovered over Blackwood. She hated mornings like these, the air heavy with silence, the kind that wasn't peaceful, but foreboding. She headed toward the chicken coop, crunching through the snow that reached her ankles. It wasn't until she was halfway across the yard that she noticed something out of place. A flicker of movement. Her eyes snapped to the field beyond the coop. There, standing stark against the endless white, was a brown horse. Its massive body was motionless, its head low as if struggling under the weight of exhaustion. But it wasn't alone. 4 wolves flanked it. Emery froze, her heart slamming in her chest. She counted again. 4. Big ones. Their grey and white coats blended eerily with the frost-bitten landscape. But their eyes burned bright and sharp, watching, waiting. Instinct screamed at her to run, to get back inside and lock the door. But she couldn't move. Something was wrong. The wolves weren't attacking. They weren't circling to close in for the kill. They were standing still, their postures calm but alert. One of them turned its head, locking eyes with her. Emery's breath caught. Her first thought was to grab her husband's rifle, but she dismissed it just as quickly. What would she do? Shoot at wolves surrounding a horse? No, it didn't make sense. None of it did. The horse shifted slightly, its legs trembling beneath it. The movement was small but deliberate, almost like it was testing its own strength. The wolves didn't flinch. They just stood their ground, their sharp gazes scanning the horizon as if guarding the horse from unseen threats. Emery's grip on her coat tightened, her fingers numb with both cold and fear. It felt like an eternity before she found the courage to back away. She stumbled through the snow, her pulse pounding in her ears as she retreated into the safety of her home. The scene shifted to Mike's tavern later that evening, the warmth of the roaring fireplace doing little to thaw the tension in the room. And they just stood there, like they were protecting it. Emery finished, her voice wavering slightly. The small crowd around her was silent for a moment, the weight of her story settling uneasily in the air. Then the laughter started. "You're telling me," Tom Lancer began, his grin wide and mocking, "that wolves, wild, bloodthirsty wolves, just decided to play bodyguard for some horse?" Emery clenched her jaw, her hands tightening around the cup of tea she hadn't touched. "You're not the first one to see something strange," Silas interjected from the corner, his gravelly voice cutting through the noise. "I told you what I saw near the glade." "And I said the same thing to you, old man," Tom said, shaking his head. "Wolves don't take orders from horses. They eat them." "Then explain what we saw," Emery snapped, her frustration spilling out. "It's one thing if it's just one of us. Maybe I doubt myself too, but Silas saw it. Two people don't just dream up the same thing." Tom shrugged. "Cold gets to people, makes you see things." A younger man at the table, Will, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Or maybe you've been sampling a little too much of Mike's whiskey, huh?" The laughter spread again, but Emery wasn't having it. She shot up from her chair, her voice steady but sharp. "If you don't believe us, fine. But if you've got the guts, go out there and prove us wrong." Will's smirk faltered for a moment before he exchanged a glance with the two men sitting next to him. They were locals like him, used to the forest and not ones to back down from a challenge. "Fine," Will said, standing. "We'll check it out. Tomorrow morning we'll take a look around the fields and see for ourselves. If there's nothing there, you can buy the drinks." "And if there is?" Silas asked quietly, his tone carrying more weight than his words. Will's smirk returned, though it looked forced now. "Then I'll eat my hat." The next morning, Will and his friends, Pete and Charlie, trudged out into the snow-covered fields, carrying ropes and a bag of grain. They joked loudly as they went, their laughter cutting through the icy air, though there was a nervous edge to it. Emery stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly, watching them disappear into the distance. It wasn't long before the men found tracks leading to the far side of the field. The horse was there, standing in a shallow dip in the snow, its legs trembling under its weight. The wolves were there too, spread out in a loose semicircle around it, their eyes sharp and watchful. "All right. Easy," Will whispered, motioning for Pete and Charlie to spread out. They crouched low, scattering handfuls of grain on the snow to lure the horse. But as soon as they took a step closer, the wolves reacted. A growl, low and guttural, rippled through the air. The largest wolf bared its teeth, stepping forward with deliberate menace. The other three followed, their hackles raised, their eyes locked on the men. Maybe we should back off," Pete hissed, his voice shaking. "Hold your ground," Will snapped, but even he sounded unsure. The wolves didn't charge, but they didn't back down either. Their growls deepened, vibrating through the air like a warning. Pete and Charlie stumbled back, tripping over their own feet in their haste. When the largest wolf snapped its jaws, the men panicked. "Go! Go!" Will shouted, abandoning the ropes and grain as they bolted back toward the village. The villagers gathered at the tavern that evening, the tension thick in the air. Will, Pete, and Charlie sat quietly, their usual bravado replaced by pale faces and shaking hands. "They're protecting it," Will muttered, staring into his untouched drink. The room buzzed with whispers, dividing the crowd. Some insisted the horse needed saving before the wolves turned on it. Others, like Silas, argued that it wasn't their place to interfere. And so, the village remained in a state of uneasy curiosity, drawn to the mystery but wary of its consequences. By the next day, the photo of the horse and wolves had circulated through the village, and theories began to sprout like weeds in the cold soil of Blackwood. Frank Miller, the pragmatic owner of the hunting supplies store, leaned on the counter, addressing a group of locals. "It's simple, really," he said, his tone casual but confident. "That horse ain't no leader. It's just bait." "Bait?" Emery asked sharply. Frank nodded, crossing his arms. "Wolves are smart, see? Smarter than we give 'em credit for. I reckon that horse is weak, maybe injured. They're keeping it alive just long enough to draw in other prey. Once food gets scarce enough, well, even a horse'll do." A few people nodded, their expressions grim. But not everyone was convinced. "That doesn't explain why they're not eating it now," Silas countered. "If they were desperate, they wouldn't wait." Frank shrugged. "Maybe they're not hungry enough yet, or maybe it's just easier to keep the horse around for now." In another corner of the village, the schoolhouse hosted its own version of the debate. Mr. Thompson, the local biology teacher, stood in front of a chalkboard where he'd scrawled a rough diagram of a wolf pack. "Now, think about this," he said, pointing to the board with a piece of chalk. "In extreme conditions, animals adapt. Cooperation between species isn't unheard of. This could be a case of mutual benefit. The wolves protect the horse from predators, bears perhaps, and in return, the horse helps them find food or provides warmth." A hand shot up in the crowd of listeners. "You're saying the horse and the wolves teamed up?" Thompson nodded. "It's not impossible. Survival makes strange alliances." The murmurs grew louder, splitting into factions. Some sided with Frank, convinced that the wolves were using the horse as a trap. Others leaned toward Thompson's theory, intrigued by the idea of a fragile truce forged in the harshest winter Blackwood had ever seen. It wasn't long before the story of the horse and the wolves escaped the confines of the village. A young man named Ethan, visiting his relatives in Blackwood, had snapped a few photos of the clearing. He posted them online with a caption, "Ever seen wolves guarding a horse? Blackwood mystery, folks." The post exploded. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, reaching local newspapers, then regional wildlife blogs, and eventually national outlets. By the end of the week, reporters had begun trickling into the village, their cameras slung over their shoulders as they pestered locals for interviews. Miles away in Riverside, Evan Bennett sat in his dimly lit apartment, scrolling through his phone. His walls were adorned with hunting trophies, antlers, pelts, photographs of successful hunts. But the story he'd stumbled upon wasn't about another hunter's conquest. The photo stopped him mid-scroll, a horse surrounded by wolves. Evan frowned, tapping the image to enlarge it. It wasn't the quality that intrigued him. It was the sheer impossibility of what it depicted. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair. "No way," he muttered, shaking his head. "No damn way." But as he scrolled through the comments and read the accompanying articles, his skepticism began to waver. Wildlife experts were arguing over it. Locals were swearing it was real, and the photos felt too consistent to be fakes. For Evan, it wasn't just about curiosity. It was about pride. He was a hunter, one of the best. If this story was true, if a horse was somehow controlling a wolf pack, then it was the kind of challenge he couldn't resist. By the next morning, Evan had made up his mind. He packed his gear meticulously: camouflage clothing, trail cameras, bait, and a rifle he'd trusted for years. The night was pitch black, with only the cold glow of his headlights cutting through the dense fog that clung to the winding road. Evan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw set in determination. He had driven through the night, the hum of the engine his only companion. The faint outline of Blackwood was finally coming into view. He'd read enough about this place, isolated, unforgiving in the winter and brimming with tales of strange happenings. The photos of the horse and its wolf entourage had stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in years, a challenge. Evan wasn't just a hunter, he was the hunter. And he wasn't going to let some small-town mystery go unanswered. Pulling into the village just past dawn, Evan parked his truck outside a nondescript motel. The wooden sign creaked in the icy wind, and the snow beneath his boots crunched as he stepped out. He didn't expect a warm welcome, and he wasn't here to make friends. Inside, the clerk barely glanced at him as he handed over a key. "Rooms round back, second floor," the man muttered. Evan nodded, slinging his gear bag over his shoulder. He didn't bother with small talk. The less attention he drew, the better. By the time the sun fully broke through the grey sky, Evan was already deep into the forest. His boots left shallow imprints in the snow, his rifle strapped securely across his back, and his pack filled with trail cameras, bait, and rations. He moved with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning every branch and footprint. The forest was silent. No birds chirped, no rustling in the underbrush, no distant calls of wildlife, just the crunch of his boots and the occasional snap of a frozen branch underfoot. Evan had hunted in quiet places before, but this was different. The silence wasn't natural. It was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Hours passed, and he found nothing but faint tracks in the snow. Wolf tracks. They were too spread out to belong to a typical pack, and the impressions were deeper than usual, as if they'd been circling an area for some time. Evan followed the trail, his instincts kicking in. He moved slowly, crouching low whenever he caught the faintest sound. It wasn't until he heard it, the long, mournful howl, that his pulse quickened. The sound carried through the trees, low and haunting, sending a shiver down his spine. Evan gripped his rifle and adjusted his pack, his boots crunching softly as he moved toward the source. The clearing appeared suddenly, like stepping into another world. Evan stopped in his tracks, his breath clouding in the icy air. There it was, the horse. It stood in the center of the snow-covered field, its brown coat almost glowing in the dim light. Its legs trembled slightly, but its posture was steady. Surrounding it, the wolves moved in unison, their eyes alert, their bodies coiled with readiness. They weren't attacking, they weren't resting, they were guarding. Evan blinked, his hunter's mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. He crouched behind a fallen tree, his breath shallow. Every instinct told him to stay hidden. The wolves moved with precision, their movements deliberate. The largest one, a grizzled, silver-coated alpha, sniffed the air, its ears twitching. The others followed suit, circling the horse in a protective formation. Faye. Evan's heart pounded as he slowly unslung his rifle. He couldn't afford to waste this moment. If he could bring down the horse, prove this wasn't some supernatural anomaly, it would be the crowning achievement of his career. He raised the rifle, the cold metal biting into his cheek as he lined up the shot. Then it happened. A sharp crack echoed through the clearing as the branch beneath his knee gave way. Evan barely had time to register his mistake before he tumbled forward, landing hard in the snow. His rifle clattered against the frozen ground, the noise shattering the silence like a gunshot. The wolves reacted instantly. Snarls erupted around him as the pack turned, their eyes blazing with predatory focus. Evan scrambled for his rifle, but the largest wolf was already closing in, its teeth bared in a low, guttural growl. He froze, his hands raised defensively. The wolf stopped just feet from him, its breath visible in the icy air. The others circled him, their movements calculated, their growls rumbling like distant thunder. Evan's pulse raced as he locked eyes with the alpha. He expected an attack, but it never came. The growls softened, replaced by an eerie stillness. The horse stepped forward, its hooves crunching softly in the snow. Evan's breath hitched as it came closer, its dark eyes fixed on him. It wasn't fear he saw in those eyes. It was something else. The horse stopped a few feet away, its head tilting slightly as if studying him. The wolves stood back, their watchful eyes darting between the horse and the hunter. Evan didn't move. He didn't breathe. The horse took another step forward, its nostrils flaring as it exhaled a warm breath that misted in the cold. Its gaze was steady, almost probing, as if it was deciding something. Evan's fingers twitched, his mind screaming at him to grab the rifle. Then, just as suddenly as it had approached, the horse turned away. Its tail flicked softly as it moved back to the center of the clearing. The wolves followed, their snarls fading into silence. Evan remained crouched in the snow, his chest heaving. He couldn't explain what had just happened. The rifle felt heavier than it should have. Evan sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the vast, snow-draped expanse of Blackwood Forest, the weapon resting across his knees. The morning's events replayed in his mind on an endless loop. The wolves' unrelenting gaze, the horse's calm presence, and his own hesitation. He rubbed a gloved hand across his face, exhaling sharply. This wasn't what he came here for. When Evan first heard about the strange alliance between a wild horse and a pack of wolves, he'd been skeptical. He came to Blackwood to prove the story wrong, or at the very least claim the horse as his prize, a trophy, something to hang on his wall as a testament to his dominance over nature. But now, the hunter in him was at war with something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. Evan looked down at his rifle. The polished metal gleamed in the muted sunlight, the bullet still tucked in his pocket. For the first time in his career, the weapon felt foreign, out of place. He sighed, leaning back against the cold rock. What the hell am I doing? The horse wasn't just a target anymore. It was a part of something extraordinary, something he couldn't explain, but knew he didn't have the right to destroy. The wolves weren't predators. They were protectors. And the horse. The horse wasn't just surviving. It was thriving in a way that defied everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The weight of his actions hit him hard. His fingers tightened on the rifle stock, then slowly loosened. He couldn't do it. Evan reached into his pocket, pulling out the bullets one by one. He dropped them into the snow at his feet, watching as they sank into the icy powder. Then, with deliberate care, he unlatched the rifle's chamber, removed the remaining round, and set the weapon aside. By the time he returned to the small motel that evening, Evan had made up his mind. He packed his gear in silence, careful not to leave anything behind that might betray his presence. The rifle stayed in its case, untouched. When he handed the key back to the clerk, the man raised an eyebrow. "Leaving so soon?" Evan nodded. "Didn't find what I was looking for. Figured a guy like you wouldn't quit so easy." Evan smirked faintly, but said nothing. As he drove out of Blackwood, the forest stretched endlessly on either side of the narrow road. He caught glimpses of movement in the shadows, wolves perhaps, or just his imagination. Weeks passed, and the strange sightings around Blackwood became less frequent. The villagers, once divided in their beliefs, began to settle into a quiet acceptance of the unusual phenomenon. Silas and Emery were among the first to notice the shift. "The wolves aren't coming as close to the village anymore," Silas remarked one evening at Mike's tavern. Emery nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think they're staying deeper in the forest. Maybe they don't trust us." "Can't blame 'em," Silas replied, his voice tinged with regret. Every winter, like clockwork, the wolves returned to the edges of Blackwood. They were quieter now, more elusive, but their presence was unmistakable. Silas swore he'd seen the horse leading them one frosty morning, its coat catching the first rays of sunlight as they moved together across the snow. "It's like they're reminding us," Silas mused to Emery later that day. "Reminding us of what?" she asked. Silas shrugged. "That some things aren't meant to be interfered with." Though the sightings became rarer, the impact of the story spread far beyond Blackwood. Wildlife enthusiasts and researchers occasionally visited, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary group. None ever succeeded. Spring had come to Blackwood, and with it, the disappearance of the enigmatic group of animals. For weeks, Silas had returned to the edges of the forest, hoping for some sign, a paw print, a hoof mark, anything, but each trip ended in the same silent realization. They were gone. He didn't feel disappointment, nor did he worry. Something about their absence felt natural, as though the wolves and the horse had fulfilled whatever purpose had drawn them here. "They've moved on," Silas muttered to himself, leaning on his walking stick. His voice was calm, steady, but his mind wandered. Where had they gone? What were they seeking? He had no answers, only the quiet assurance that the forest had returned to its usual rhythm, albeit with a lingering sense of loss. Blackwood's children grew up hearing the story of the protector of Blackwood and its white sentinels. Parents told it on cold winter nights, embellishing details to captivate their young audiences. "They say the horse wasn't just a horse," Emery explained one evening to a group of wide-eyed kids. "It had a kind of magic. The wolves weren't protecting it out of instinct. They were following it, as if it was their leader." "What happened to them?" a boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emery smiled. "They left when the time was right. Maybe they're out there, watching us, making sure we respect the forest." The children exchanged glances, their imaginations filling in the gaps. The story became woven into the fabric of the village's identity. Blackwood's hunters grew more cautious, its farmers more aware of the land they tended. The forest was no longer just a resource. It was a living, breathing thing to be respected. Even years later, whispers persisted about the group's return. On occasion, villagers reported strange signs: a patch of snow disturbed in a circular pattern, claw marks on a tree, or the distant sound of a low howl on a still night. One winter, a young trapper swore he saw the faint outline of a horse leading a pack of wolves across a ridge during a heavy snowfall. The story spread quickly, igniting a fresh wave of curiosity. But Silas, now older and slower in his movements, simply smiled when he heard these tales. "Maybe they're still out there," he'd say, though he didn't need to believe it himself. What mattered was the hope the story inspired in others. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around until the end of this video. Now that we've explored the mysterious and thought-provoking tale of the horse and its wolf guardians, let's take a moment to reflect on what it all means. Sure, it's a fictional story, but that doesn't make it any less powerful. At its core, this is a tale about survival, respect for nature, and the unexpected alliances that can emerge in the harshest of circumstances. It challenges our perceptions of how the natural world works, and invites us to think about the balance between instinct, survival, and even compassion. For me, the most striking part of this story is the transformation it inspires, not just in the characters, but in us as readers. Silas learns to see the forest not as a place of danger, but as something sacred. Emery stands up for what she believes, showing the strength of community and curiosity. And Evan, the seasoned hunter, lets go of his pride to embrace something far bigger than himself. These moments remind us that growth often comes from the most unexpected places. On a deeper level, this story asks a question we all need to consider. How do we coexist with the world around us? It's not just about wolves and horses, it's about us, our relationships, and the way we approach life's mysteries. So, what do you think? Did this story resonate with you or make you think about nature in a different way? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your take. And hey, if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more thought-provoking tales. Until next time, stay curious